here's my cheat sheet. So I want you to know that I am at least attempting to stay on topic. The title of the course is What Your Teacher Never Taught You. And I started out last week. Several members here have been with me for several semesters. And what I started out with last week is a good introduction. If you've ever taken a look at the world in which you are living and have questioned the structure that you have grown up with, that you live in a democracy, you live in the world's best democracy, and started questioning A, B, C, or D about the choices that your government has made in the name of your democracy, you're going to start questioning one hell of a lot of pieces of information. For that reason, I titled this What Your Teacher Never Told You, because the misconceptions that you have been brainwashed with are legion. So the question is, who arranged for that brainwashing? Where are they going instead of where we as a citizenry would like to go? And why? Well, there are a variety of ways of asking that question, okay? But this is my cheat sheet so that you know that I'm actually trying to stay on subject. Now, there it goes. What this course has dealt with over the last couple years are these questions. 9/11 was not executed by 19 Arabs, but by elements of the United States deep state and the Mossad. Now, that conclusion was in no wise proven by what I have shared with these class members. But I want to go through very, very briefly, so as not to bore the people who have been through this for 4 semesters, why the story that you were fed about 9/11. We are not talking about the Civil War, we're not talking about the Revolutionary War, we're not talking about the First World War or the Second World War or Vietnam, any of those, particularly yet. But 9/11, what you were told was that 19 Arabs successfully hijacked 4 aircraft, successfully evaded or neutralized the North NORAD, whatever that stands for, and crashed 2 planes into the World Trade Center buildings and 1 plane into the Pentagon. That was declared an act of war by the president at that time and was the justification for the so-called war on terror, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and has been used to justify, because of the authorization for the use of military force, military activity in Syria, Sudan, Niger, and a host of other places. Now, let us talk about the official story about 9/11. The so-called 19 Arabs were terrible pilots. Well documented that the people who are described as being the pilots that were recruited by Al-Qaeda were just lousy pilots. At least 2 of the aircraft, of those 4 aircraft, flew maneuvers that the best military pilots extant today say they would have to practice real hard in order to accomplish. Moreover, Michael Springman says that when he attempted to enforce then existing standards for the issuance of United States visas for Arabs attempting to either emigrate or simply visit the United States, on a multitude of occasions when he attempted to prevent certain people from coming to the United States, he was overridden by the State Department. Translated, certain people in the State Department wanted those people to get to the United States. The only photographs we have of those 19 pilots are a couple guys who, instead of being photographed at one of the 2 or 3, I don't recall at the moment, airports, they went to a different airport up in Maine, and they were so-called caught on camera at that Maine airport, so that there would be some airport photographs of our reported hijackers. Let's see, what else? Oh, the 19 Arabs that the FBI subsequently identified within 24 hours. Got to give the FBI credit. They had their information right at hand. Within 24 hours, they identified 19 Arabs, even though their names did not appear on the rosters of the 4 aircraft that were supposedly hijacked. 5 of those individuals still happen to be alive and wrote letters to their embassies in Egypt and I believe Tunisia, but don't hold me to that. Wrote letters objecting to being accused of being criminals because they were already gainfully employed and had been gainfully employed in one or another industries in their respective towns. So that's what we know about the so-called hijackers. What do we know about the planes? Well, 2 of the planes clearly flew well beyond their aeronautical envelopes. What that means is they were physically incapable of flying the flight paths that our government says they flew. It's kind of like saying, I drove my Toyota Corolla at 250 miles an hour for 6 hours and I didn't have to stop for gas. Well, I can't go that long in my Corolla. I can't drive 250 miles an hour, and I guarantee you, if I drove for 6 hours, I'd have to stop for gas. Let's see, what else? Oh, when I say that they flew outside their envelopes, at least one of the 4, because we have caught the last several seconds of its flight on videotape, flew a pattern that would be virtually impossible for a human being to fly. It's not saying that the plane didn't fly that way, it's saying that in terms of maneuver and response time, the probability is exceedingly high that that plane was governed by a computer getting instructions from another computer. It's the only way it could have responded to flight and air conditions that quickly at that time. A human being simply doesn't respond that fast. Another of the airplane, the one that supposedly flew into the Pentagon, not only did it fly outside its envelope, it flew inches above the ground for several hundred yards, which is physically impossible. Because of the air pressure that develops when a large aircraft is close to the ground, it creates sufficient pressure that the aircraft cannot fly, literally cannot fly at a high speed close to the ground. It's because the air pressure underneath it pushes up on the wings and it increases the altitude of the aircraft flying. Moreover, very miraculously, that aircraft flew after hitting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lampposts, when a plane cannot fly at all after hitting 1 lamppost. Moreover, miraculously, it vaporized when it hit the Pentagon so that landing gear and engines disappeared, can't be found. But equally mysteriously, the DNA from the reported passengers was found and led to the identification of those passengers. I hope I'm describing a relatively absurd situation so far. Let's see, of the 4 black boxes that flew with the 2 aircraft that hit the World Trade Centers, the FBI says none of those 4 were found. Although volunteers going through the wreckage, through the rubble at the World Trade Center says that at least 2 of the 4 were found. But our government tells us that none of them were found, okay? Our government also tells us that one of the data recorders from the plane that so-called hit the Pentagon was found. But very curiously, when you check records, the flight, I don't honestly recall, I think it must have been the flight, the cockpit voice recorder. The cockpit voice recorder was a tape type recorder, and the aircraft that was being flown had already been upgraded to use digital chip recording rather than tape recording. Somehow that cockpit voice recorder transmogrified into an older type of instrument. Moreover, when the flight data that is released by the FBI about the plane that hit the Pentagon, when that flight data is evaluated by Pilots for 9/11 Truth and corrected for registered altitude versus altitude above terrain, because the altitudes are measured above sea level. So you have to account for how high is the land above sea level so that you know how high the aircraft is. Because let's say a hill is 500 feet above sea level and you are told that the aircraft is flying at 350 feet above sea level, that aircraft is flying through the ground. The flight data recorded that I'm referring to, when it's analyzed by the Pilots for 9/11 Truth, indicates that whatever aircraft recorded that flight data actually flew over the Pentagon, not into it. Now let's see, that's what I can tell you about the miraculous aircraft and the superhuman pilots. In terms of legal investigation of the 2 sites of criminal activity, the Pentagon and the World Trade Centers, none of that material was treated as a crime scene. The FBI took control of the 2 sites very quickly, but they discarded literally hundreds of tons of steel before it was forensically examined. The hole that appears in the Pentagon does not suggest either 2 engines or 2 virtually indestructible suspension systems, wheel systems went through it. There's no evidence of engines going through, and as I say, the metal from that destruction is reported to have vaporized. Now, what do we actually know? We know that thermite dust, both reacted and unreacted, was found in the dust that settled in New York City after the destruction of the World Trade Centers. You will very appropriately, I hope, ask what the devil is thermite. I played with thermite when I was in high school because I had the privilege of studying under a very ingenious chemistry teacher, and I had at the time been working at a place where I had access to titanium dioxide. And I wondered to my teacher, what would happen if I mixed titanium dioxide, a small amount of it, with the elements of thermite? And he said, let's find out. Now, thermite, if any of you have some chemistry, thermite is a mixture of iron particles. Let me get this straight now. Thermite is a mixture of iron rust, ferric oxide, and elemental aluminum, aluminum powder. When you get that hot enough with a fuse like lighting a magnesium wick, the aluminum reduces the iron oxide to molten iron, and the aluminum stops being elemental aluminum and oxidizes, because the aluminum has a greater attraction for the oxygen than does the iron. Now, you don't have to know any chemistry to know that that gets real hot. And the point of getting it real hot is that you get molten iron, and you can melt whatever melts below the temperature of molten iron. The unreacted thermite, as well as the products of that reaction, were found in the dust, strongly suggesting that someone, instead of destroying those World Trade Center buildings with 2 aircraft, destroyed those 2 buildings at least with some elements of thermite. Maybe some other explosives and or incendiaries as well, but there's certainly substantial evidence that thermite was involved. Not only did we find the elements by the way of iron dust, little micro droplets of iron in the World Trade Center dust, but because whoever put that thermite where it was put one great deal of it, some of it remained unreacted. So that if you look for the right colored particles, you can find unreacted thermite. And if you get a little particle of that thermite hot, you can see it flare up exactly the way thermite does. Exactly the way it did in my high school class when I mixed about 10% titanium dioxide with 90% of regular thermite. Now, I never measured the tensile strength of what we got out of it, but I'm confident that we actually reduced the titanium as well as the iron. What else can I tell you about 9/11? That's the thing. I can tell you that the first professor of engineering who wrote a report on why the buildings fell submitted that report for publication about 24 hours after the buildings fell. Now, some of you may have some experience with university publications and with academic publications as a whole. You may be able to get an article into the Iowa City Press Citizen 24 hours before it's published. If you submit a world-shattering article to Science, you might get it published a week or 2 after you have submitted it. The guy who wrote that article had to have written it, just in terms of practical writing skills. He knew what was going to happen, and he wrote an academic justification for what was going to happen. Materials. Oh, Osama bin Laden was a United States asset as early as 1979. Zbigniew Brzezinski initiated the Afghani opposition to Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and Brzezinski's plan was to give the Soviet Union their Vietnam. So Brzezinski and the deep portion of the American deep state recruited Arabs, recruited Muslims, many of whom were Arabs, one of whom was Osama bin Laden, in either 1979 or the very early part of the 1980s, precisely in order to teach them that the Soviets were godless and you got to throw them out of Muslim lands. And they successfully spread this propaganda so that they recruited a number of mujahideen and jihadi Muslims to resist the atheistic communists. So Osama bin Laden was useful in the 1980s and in the 1990s, because once the Soviet Union had left Afghanistan, you had jihadis going to Chechnya to give the Soviet Union additional headaches with the First and Second Chechen War. You had Muslims going to Kosovo and to Serbia to raise havoc there so as to participate in the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Then, when they needed another boogeyman, they recruited Osama bin Laden and said, "You're going to take the rap for 9/11. Was Saudi Arabia involved in any of it? It's entirely possible that in addition to the FBI financing some of the Arabs who were served as patsies, they didn't do it. As I've intimated, the probability is very strong that whatever aircraft were flying were being flown by remote control. There's a whole other section on the flight termination system that was financed by a firm whose head was Dov Zakheim, the head of the Pentagon finance section. And Dov Zakheim is an Israeli, I believe he is an Orthodox rabbi who is working for the Pentagon, and I'm not 100% certain of this, but I believe he's a dual citizen of both Israel and of the United States. In fact, you will find a whole lot of people who are either Jewish Zionists or dual citizens of Israel and the United States involved in all of this. Oh, I almost overlooked a couple of very interesting features. In the NORAD chain of command, when we look at what that chain of command did when those 4 aircraft were supposedly hijacked, with the possible exception of 2 functionaries, every single one of them was either fantastically derelict in their duties or were criminally perpetrating treason. I don't have time. I can refer you to several good documentaries on 9/11, one of which being Zero, which is produced by some European producers, another one of which is produced by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. If you're interested, just tell me at the end of class. I'll send you several, the names of several good documentaries on going over this. But the short story is that if you look at what responsible individuals at NORAD were doing, they basically were using the outhouse without closing the darn door. Okay? What else can I tell you? Dawn.
When you were talking about the material, the university report didn't mention thermite, did it? It had another theory of collapse of the building?
That is correct. In fact, let's go back to their theory of the collapse of the building. In the history of modern steel and concrete construction, 3 buildings have fallen who were constructed with modern techniques of steel and concrete reinforcement. As a chemist and as a physician, this was the first piece of information that caught my attention. Those 3 buildings that fell due to fire fell on the same day. And as a chemist and as a physician who respects what statistics tell you, that told me back around 2007 that that's a different population. It is true that 2 of the 3 buildings fell after also being struck by aircraft. Those buildings, however, the designer of the buildings will tell you that the buildings were designed to withstand multiple, at least one impact from an aircraft, and probably multiple impacts. If you look at their construction, they had 2 skeletons. You have one skeleton, and a beetle has a different kind of skeleton. A beetle has his skeleton on the outside, you have your skeleton on the inside. Those buildings had 2 skeletons. They had an outside skeleton and an inside skeleton. The inside skeleton comprised 47 massive steel girders that were inches thick at the base, and by thick, I mean in terms of the thickness of the middle, not the width and the width and depth of it. At the top, they were more of the dimensions that you and I would recognize as girders, fractions of an inch thick and inches deep and wide. So it had 2 skeletons. The official reports hypothesized the weakening of those girders and the destruction of the exoskeleton by the aircraft flying. Without addressing the, how shall I put this? In all 3 cases, NIST did not describe the collapse of each of those 3 buildings. They hypothesized what took place up to and leading to the point in time when collapse became inevitable, which is the reason that none of them adequately explain what actually happened during the collapse. The initial theory was a pancaking theory where heavy structures on floor A were so weakened by the structure, by the initial impact, that they collapsed onto the floor below them, and the collapse on the floor below them caused a pancaking. That theory had to be abandoned because somebody pointed out, why don't we have the endoskeleton standing 110 stories up in the sky? So this had to go back and revise their theory and explain why the massive endoskeleton was destroyed as well as the exoskeleton. I apologize for using technical terms here. The exoskeleton is the outside, like the beetle skeleton, and the endoskeleton is the inside skeleton, like you and me. But because it had 2 skeletons, you have to explain why each of the skeletons were destroyed. NIST describes the structure as being basically a hollow tube. Well, that's true if your spinal column is a hollow tube. Now, it's hollow in that your spinal column has your spinal cord going through it. But the spinal column is also composed of discs on top of vertebra, on top of discs, on top of vertebra. So if you were to collapse into a pool, not only would someone have to explain a whole lot of other things, they'd have to explain what happened to the discs and what happened to your vertebra. And this never bothers to explain what happens to the endoskeleton of the 2 World Trade Centers. In addition, although in terms of publicity, NIST had a major advantage in the sense that people saw the buildings collapse and they were emotionally prepared for some explanation as to why they collapsed, because they in fact did collapse. the Achilles heel of the NIST explanations of all three buildings really rests on NIST's explanation of the World Trade Center 7 building. Now, some of you here may not even know that a third building collapsed on 9/11. It collapsed at about 5:13 in the afternoon, long after the dust had settled from the collapse of the first of the World Trade Centers 1 and 2. An amateur photographer had his camera rolling on it, so we have good visual documentation as to how World Trade Center collapsed. And a very good, very intelligent high school instructor of physics analyzed that data using a program that he had used with his kids for analyzing how buildings react under gravity, how falling objects react under gravity. And he concluded, and NIST had to agree with him ultimately, for the first 2.5 seconds of the collapse of World Trade Center 7, it was falling at free fall acceleration. What that means is that there was nothing underneath it. That means that it was a 47-story tall building. The 46th floor had disappeared before the 47th floor had gotten down to it. The 45th floor had disappeared before the 46th floor had gotten there. It's literally impossible. Okay? I mean to dramatize it. I don't mean to snow you with terms. If something is falling at free fall acceleration, that means there is absolutely nothing slowing it down. If you watch buildings being destroyed by controlled demolition, when the controlled demolition is done right, there's nothing holding it down. When the controlled demolition goes wrong, you can see the buildings slow down. They fall sideways. Something goes wrong, and you can see that it's gone wrong. In fact, I've commented on more than one occasion, it's a shame that the agency that arranged for the collapse of the World Trade Center's buildings can't advertise it, because it's it's a textbook demonstration of how buildings are destroyed by controlled demolition. Let's see, what else do I want to share with you? Oh, it's worth pointing out that there were two, and this does not go to the official explanation. I hope by now, if you check the facts that I have drawn your attention to, that the official explanation is nonsense. You don't have to accept my alternative explanation. But if I have raised enough questions so that the official story is nonsense, that's perfectly satisfactory to me. A substantial number of people knew that an attack was going to take place on the World Trade Center buildings. Larry Silverstein surely knew, because he had his morphine drip stopped after he was involved in some bus accident, and he was on a morphine drip, and he wanted desperately to sign a contract for him to lease the World Trade Center complex. That was somewhere in June or July of 2001. And it was so important for him to sign that otherwise incidental contract that he had his morphine drip stopped so that he would be of clear and sound mind. He invested a few $100,000 of his own money and a lot of borrowed money to finance that contract. He made roughly $4 billion. That's with a B. That's $4 billion or $4,000 million on it because of the insurance money that he collected after the buildings were destroyed. So he at least was one of the people who knew it was going to happen. There's virtually irrefutable evidence that a lot of people, important people and unimportant people, knew enough of what was going to take place that they made bets on the stock market. You make a bet on the stock market by betting that the stock of United Airlines is going to go down in 2-3 months. You don't call it a bet. Now, I always get put and short mixed up, so forgive me. But if I promise to buy you sell me a contract to buy United Airlines at $40 a share. Right now it's selling at $50 a share. You promise to buy it at $40 a share from me in 2 months. Now I'm a fool to make that unless I know something about the future. If I know something's going to happen to United Airlines stock and it's going to go down to 25, I can promise to sell it to you at 40 because I'm going to make $15. If, however, the stock doesn't go down, I have to buy it at 50 to sell it to you at 40. I'm going to lose money. A lot of people made that kind of bet on United Airlines, on one of the other airlines that was involved, on those corporations where the stock was destined to fall after 9/11. A lot of people made money by betting in the right direction.
Shorting them. It's
Thank you. I didn't even try to get it because I always get it turned upside down. On those firms that were guaranteed for their stock prices to go up, comparable bets were made in the opposite direction so that you would make money when the stock price went up, such as Boeing, such as Lockheed, such as the makers of military armaments. Now all I'm doing with the information that I'm sharing with you now is showing that a lot of people are not just conspiracy kooks. In fact, one of the basic elements of this course is that the charge of conspiracy is a great way of silencing discussion. So that's part of what we have learned in this class by doing some of our own research and reading carefully the research that good people like David Ray Griffin, Soones, and a number of other people have done. The point that I'm making is that examining data where everybody knows what the official story is often worth taking a good close look at. Some of the other things that we've looked at, and this is just to go over the kinds of questions that I and the members of this class have been willing to ask. National elections are basically frauds. At least some immunizations that you are required to have your children get are dangerous. I'll cite the example that is where most of the data has been accumulated. The trivalent MMR is required to be given to children before their 3rd birthday. Without going all of the data in the United States, an epidemic of autism is documented to have started in China when they started using the trivalent MMR and then immunizing their kids before their 3rd birthday. Interesting data on this. And again, we can go over it on another occasion. measles and mumps, I don't recall which. When those 3 immunizations are given separately, it is not, those children do not have a measured incidence of autism. When those 3 immunizations are given after the 3rd birthday, there is no measurable change in the incidence of autism. Very interesting. When this data was made known to the people administering the British health system, they refused to allow British children to be immunized separately for measles, mumps, and rubella. It was more important for those bureaucrats to keep one system of immunization than to take a serious look at the incidence of autism. Here you have bureaucrats in collaboration with corporations making money at the expense of the population. And again, I'm not trying to prove this data for you now. I'm giving you the final conclusion of some of the studies we have looked at and some of the studies that good researchers have done. Valid reasons exist for challenging man-made global warming. And Dawn, for a long time, has been an advocate of global warming, and I respect both her intelligence and her commitment to it. And we've had a number of discussions. I don't know how far she personally has come in taking a look at this. There's very little question that climate is changing. It is constantly changing. A 10-year period when it isn't changing is an oddity, okay? The question is not whether the climate is changing. The question is whether it is changing in a uniform direction and whether that uniform direction is caused by, a causal relationship is always difficult to prove, but it needs to be taken seriously, is caused by the increase of carbon dioxide that has occurred in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. The aspects that one needs to look at are the multiple factors involved in climate change and what political and or economic factors have come into play in the recent advocacy of human-generated carbon dioxide has occurred in order to provide the incentive for the political activity in terms of changing the use of various forms of energy production. In other words, not only do you have to look at the science to answer the question, you have to look at what motivation do human beings have to promote one interpretation over another. Let me give you a different example. It is unfortunately true, in terms of the case of 9/11, that you cannot find a university-employed physicist or engineer who will challenge the story, the government story of 9/11. And those few who have tried wind up having their funding withdrawn, wind up like Stephen Jones being compelled to accept early retirement from, thank you, BYU, so that only the people who acquire financial independence from the system are in a position to deal with that question. That has to be taken seriously. It's not the determining factor. It has to be taken seriously. Okay? And I phrase myself very carefully there because the jury is still out. I think there is substantial reason to challenge it, especially given the fact that there are roughly 200 people, mostly men, but not exclusively, who sit on the boards of a host of corporations. Those corporations, much more so than you as a consuming public, determine the energy policy of the Western world. And they are continuing to burn hydrocarbons. That at least has to raise the question, what do they know that you and I don't? Okay? At least some Jews have enormous influence on American foreign and domestic policy, and contrary to Americans' own interests. Now, some of the members of this class and I have not a fundamental, but a very definite difference of emphasis on this question. It is absolutely clear, and when we talk about the neoconservatives since 9/11, we'll get into this a little bit more, but it is absolutely clear that a group of Jews representing the American Israel Public Affairs Committee has enormous influence in American foreign policy. Israel is a relatively advanced, it is a Western developed country that receives roughly $4 billion a year in grants and guarantees from the American federal government. That's more than any other nation receives in terms of American charity. Moreover, a host of Israeli charities that finance both illegal and immoral activities in Israel receive tax-exempt status in the United States. I can contribute on a tax-exempt basis thousands of dollars to any of a host of Israeli organizations, and have that money be tax-exempt. If I want to fund an Irish charity, I can't do it in a tax-exempt fashion. If I want to finance an Austrian or Serbian charity, I can't get it on tax-exempt. But if I want to finance an Israeli or Jewish foundation, I can donate that money on a tax-exempt basis. As an additional aside, we will get into this recurrently, and I am very conscious of the importance of separating anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism, because I have a number of friends and have had a number of friends who are Jewish, and I respect them. There once was a saying about Germans that you can be intelligent and German, or you can be intelligent and Nazi. You cannot be a moral, intelligent Nazi. You can be an intelligent Nazi, or you can be an ethical Nazi. But if you're an ethical Nazi, you're fairly stupid, and if you're an intelligent Nazi, you're fairly immoral. That applies to being a Zionist and a Jew as well. It's possible to be an intelligent Zionist Jew, but if you're an intelligent Zionist Jew, you're an immoral person, by definition of Zionism. Likewise, if you're an ethical Jewish Zionist, you don't know what Zionism is about. The comparison is obscene and accurate. Sorry, folks, but it is. we will from time to time be exposing the extent to which Zionism perverts American foreign policy and American domestic policy. As a measure of American domestic policy, a number of states, both by, who's the head of the state? Governor. Either by governor's decree or by acts initiated by the state's assemblies, a number of states have made it illegal to boycott Israeli products. It's called the BDS movement, Boycott, Divest, and Sanction. And a number of states have said, if you're going to boycott and advocate the BDS movement in Israel, you cannot supply the state of Iowa, for example, with public services. We will not hire you to do our public services work if you're participating in the BDS movement. We will not buy fluorescent light bulbs from you if you participate in BDS. And that's interfering with local and state activities on the basis of what is good for Israel, not what is good for Iowa. A number of mass murders are fraudulent, and some accidents are in fact murder. Whether we're talking about the Boston Marathon, whether we're talking about that shooting in Florida, whether we're talking about that shooting in Colorado, those have the smell of 4-day-old fish. Interestingly enough, the murders at Columbine and the murders at Virginia Tech were in fact authentic mass murders. The point that I am making is that sometimes agencies want to shape public opinion. And one of the most important things about 9/11 was the shaping of public opinion that Muslims in general and Arabs in specifically are dangerous to Americans. That was very important for some people managing the 9/11 attack. And very often the question needs to be raised, and the answer usually has a lot of significance. Who benefits? And I will guarantee you, not only did the military-industrial complex benefit tremendously from 9/11, but the Israeli government and the neoconservatives in American government benefited tremendously. I'll take a second as an aside here and mention that a group of American, mostly Jewish politicians wrote a paper for Benjamin Netanyahu in the late 90s. And it is called A Clean Break. And it was recommended to Netanyahu that they assume a military posture against their Arab neighbors instead of attempting to work with them on an equal one-to-one basis. Instead of using diplomacy, use military might. A group of American Israeli Jewish politicians with a tremendous amount of overlap with that first group wrote the program for the New American Century that was submitted to Bill Clinton. And that program recommended the very same program. But interestingly enough, it was described in terms that were beneficial to the United States rather than beneficial to the nation state of Israel. One of the classic quotations from the PNAC document that was submitted to Bill Clinton was that the change in American military spending will not take place, will only take place gradually, lacking a major change like a new Pearl Harbor. That, if I'm not quoting it verbatim, I apologize. But the point is that they expected a military change to take place very, very gradually, unless there was some special motivating factor like a new Pearl Harbor. And 9/11 provided their new Pearl Harbor. The point that I'm making here is that that particular group of people, when they were writing for Benjamin Netanyahu, advocated military intervention for Israel's benefit. The virtually identical group advocated military intervention in the Middle East to Bill Clinton, but they advocated it on the basis of what was good for the United States. At least two Jewish Holocausts exist. The mythic one and the historic one. The mythic one involves the use of hydrogen cyanide gas administered in gas chambers and killing a minimum of 6 million Jews. That is the one that is propagated and advocated by virtually every propagandist for the Holocaust. And if you don't agree with the mythic Holocaust, you will be called a Holocaust denier. And by use of public opinion persuasion, you will be on the same moral level as a pedophile. Murderers are somewhat higher on the moral scale. A pedophile and a Holocaust denier are kind of on the same scale. The other Holocausts involved the loss of employment by a substantial number of Jewish civil servants in the early 1930s, the loss of livelihood and property in the late 1930s, and the expulsion from Europe to Eastern Europe and to Russia in the early 1940s. In that expulsion, they were subjected to slave labor camps as well as forced expulsion. They were exposed to horrendous living conditions in the slave labor camps. They were exposed to slave labor and to diseases characteristic of living in close quarters, especially typhus. And they were exposed to a certain number of sadistic German guards. They were not exposed to a planned extermination. The final solution was a plan for expulsion, not for extermination. But those are two different Holocausts. And where I stand in terms of which one is real, I think is fairly obvious. And it occurred to me, first, in addition to the questions on the Holocaust, if you read any of the real histories of the Nuremberg Tribunal, you'll come to the conclusion that they were only slightly better than the Soviet show trials. It's kind of a shame that Robert Jackson's summation of the Nuremberg Tribunal about aggressive war and embracing all of the other war crimes, because it is the fundamental war crime. Aggressive war is the fundamental war crime, enabling all of the other war crimes. Jackson may have been right with that assertion, but basing that assertion on the legitimacy of the Nuremberg tribunals is a bad idea. Because if you examine from a historical basis the Nuremberg tribunals, they were a short trial. Sorry. And the last thing, hope there are no dentists here, but ingested fluoride is really bad for your health. It's bad for infants, and in substantial quantities it's bad for you. It's very good, however, for the aluminum industry, because it gives them a way of getting rid of fluoride as a waste product in the production of aluminum, where they don't have to pay for expensive elimination of a byproduct of their activity. They can sell it instead of disposing of it in a safe fashion. Now that's what this class has been about for the last 2 years. Questions or comments, including from those who have been through the last 2 years with me? Okay. Who is that delightful old lady who was here last week and isn't here today?
Elsie?
Elsie, thank you, thank you. I hope Elsie's coming back, but I know her schedule is set. Elsie had asked me about the Civil War. And I wanted to use it as an example of exposing what is going on. About 1827. Now, let me go back a second. Even though black slaves were 60% of human beings in a legal fashion, the North still dominated the Congress of the United States, population-wise. Even when you include black people as 60% of the human being, the South could not get a program through unless they could arrange to cooperate with at least some Northerners. If the Northerners formed a unified body, they could get anything through Congress. That's just the way, it's like Congress today, both the Senate and the House being controlled by Republicans. If the Republicans maintain the unity, they can get anything done, and the Democrats can't get anything done. In or about 1827, the American Congress established a tariff on imported manufactured goods, which means that a Northerner who wants to buy a piece of equipment that one of his fellow Northerners make or a European makes, the Northern producer of that equipment has a financial advantage. The European not only has to sell his product, but he has to sell it at a high enough price so that he can pay the tariff to the United States government. So implicitly, let's suppose their prices are identical. In theory, when the price is quoted to the buyer said, this one's $50 and this one's $70. They both really cost $50, but $20 goes to the federal government. Now, let's suppose a Southerner wants to buy that equipment. The Southerner is going to pay $60 for that piece of equipment because he lives in the South. And you have to get the piece of equipment from Chicago down to Savannah. Transportation charges. That same piece of equipment is going to cost at least $70 and maybe an additional $10 for the price of transportation. But it's going to cost at least $70. So he's going to be looking at paying $60 to the Northerner or $70 to the European. He still is going to buy the Northerner's equipment. But either way, he is suffering because of the tariff on manufactured goods. However, the Northerner who wants to buy cotton can buy cotton from Britain, producing it in India. India was producing cotton for Britain in 1860. We can buy it from the Georgian. Now, he may have to pay a little for transportation, but there's no tariff on Indian cotton. So on a competitive basis for raw goods, the Southerner has to sell his goods at the same price that the British manager of the Indian company does. So he doesn't make any additional money when he sells, but he pays additional money to the northerner when he buys the manufactured goods. Now, that was called the abominable tariff in about 1828. And if I'm wrong by a few years on the date, I ask your forgiveness. That tariff created so much hostility in the South that it was amended substantially in the mid-1840s. So the Southerners had it somewhat better. They were still, I want to describe it in terms of colonialism. If you are aware of how an empire works, an empire makes its money very largely by buying raw materials from its colony and selling manufactured goods, value-added goods, back to the colony. So they buy low and sell high. It's a great system for the people who are adding value with their machinery. In the first half of the 19th century, the northern states were in the advantage, had the same advantage that the colonial masters had. They buy low, whether they're buying cotton, whether they're buying iron ore, and selling high. They revised the tariff in the mid-1840s because it was really a cause of tremendous hostility in the South, even in the 1840s. Okay? In 1857, remember the Northerners controlled the Congress. If they remain unified, they control the Congress. It became obvious in 1857 that there was a substantial political movement, probably for the generation of federal income, to reimpose a tariff on manufactured goods. And that caused tremendous amount of hostility from the Southerners. It hadn't yet been enacted. But when Lincoln was elected in 1860, it became obvious that the Northerners were going to reinstitute that tariff. When that tariff was actually reintroduced, at least South Carolina, and I think several other southern states, had already declared that their senators and representatives had already left Congress, and they had declared that they're going to secede from the Union. And I suspect that the remaining representatives and senators basically passed that tariff saying, suck it up. We're going to do this. Interestingly enough, and I don't recall the name of the constitutional amendment that was introduced. That same Congress that had voted to reinstitute the tariff had voted a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the perpetuity of black slavery. So with one hand they said, we're going to tax the Southerners, and with the other hand they said, but you can keep your slaves. When American history makes slavery the key issue in the creation of the Civil War, they're basically lying. If you read Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, it is one of the best defenses of black slavery you will ever read. Now, because I want to sum this up, the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated in 1922. The Mount Rushmore Memorial of Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson,
Teddy Roosevelt,
George Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt, that was dedicated in 1928. The 1920s were very important, and we will get to that exactly why they were important. I am going to, I've got halfway through my cheat sheet. Shows you why I want to go to 4 o'clock. We aren't going to go all the way to 4 o'clock. I want to show you a discussion that took place on Crosstalk about 9/11. Susan Lindauer, Richard Gage, and I think it's Zunas are the 3 people. The important thing about this discussion is that it will not take place on American television, because it is forbidden to give people who are advocating for 9/11 truth an audience on American television. That's the primary reason I want to show it to you, and I want you to understand that when David Lavelle, Peter Lavelle, when Peter Lavelle was establishing this panel of people to discuss 9/11, he invited opposition members. He invited people who were known for defending the official story. They refused to show up. And I want you to know that the reason they refused to show up is that by showing up, they would have had to debate rather than use the argument that your point of view is silly, rather than using the argument that you are stupid, rather than using the argument that everybody knows what really happened on 9/11. They would have had to debate the facts of the question, and frankly, the facts of the question aren't in their favor. Some lawyer said, when I'm arguing a case and the law is on my side and the facts aren't, I'll pound the law. And when the facts of the case are on my side, but the law isn't, I will pound on the facts. And when neither the law nor the facts are on my side, I'll pound the table. Well, that's the situation that the defenders of the official story have. So, with that at hand, I will go to this.
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. They call themselves 9/11 truthers, skeptics, and truth activists. Largely denied access to mainstream media, their detractors label them as conspiracy theorists and worse. Nonetheless, there's no denying the fact interest remains strong surrounding the events of 9/11. So, to try to find out what really happened, I'm joined by Annie Machon in Dusseldorf. She's a former MI5 officer and now an author and journalist. In London, we pass to Ian Henschel, the author of 9/11 New Evidence and the coordinator of Reinvestigate 9/11 campaign. And in Philadelphia, we cross to Richard Gage, the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And another member of our Crosstalk team, Ilana Hunga. All right, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. I'd like to go to Richard first. I watched your DVD, Blueprint for Truth. And one of the things you keep bringing up is the authenticity of science. Now, would you show that DVD to like Scientific American or Popular Mechanics? Would they pass it for you? Would they give you good marks?
If they're watching it with integrity, you bet they will. In fact, we've given this presentation to over 140 audiences worldwide, and by a show of hands, those who didn't agree with us beforehand almost universally agree with us that these 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers were brought down by explosive demolition on 9/11, not by fire and jet plane impacts. And this includes architects and engineers, for which we have now over 1,000 signed on to our petition demanding a new investigation of Congress.
Okay, but Richard, doesn't it get down to our scientists versus their scientists? I mean, one of the things I'm trying to get at here is that it's really pitched to a scientific community, and if you guys are all arguing among yourselves, how is a general person like myself, I'm not a scientist, then who do I believe? Because a lot of scientists say this is all rubbish.
Indeed, when you look at the evidence, it's very, very clear. Anybody, not just scientists, not just architects and engineers, but most people who've seen an implosion, a controlled demolition of a skyscraper before on TV, like the old hotels in Las Vegas. This is exactly how Building 7 comes down, straight down, uniformly, into its own footprint, defying the laws of physics, if we believe the story that we're told from NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. This building can't convert all of its gravitational potential into kinetic energy and fall at free fall speed and do any other work, like crushing the 40,000 tons of structural steel in the way. This is pure science, pure physics. Nobody can argue with it.
Okay, Ian, if I can go to you, is it just pure physics? Of course it's not. It's a lot of politics involved, too. I mean, people that distrust the 9/11 Commission are called conspiracy theorists, are called crazy. I mean, where is their voice? Because certainly in the mainstream in the United States, it's basically taboo to talk about it. What's wrong with questioning? And this is really what this program's all about.
Well, that's right. You know, most of what we have to deal with is not argument, but smears, name-calling. You've got the four great techniques, you know, of the Stalinists, of people who aren't interested in the truth. Name-calling, that means saying we're conspiracy theorists. Guilt by association. Oh, you know, we found somebody who's a Holocaust denier in their movement, so therefore you shouldn't ever listen to anything they say. Straw man arguments. Oh, are you saying George Bush blew up the World Trade Center? No, we're not saying that. That's a straw man argument. And then whispering, probably the nastiest of all are the whispering campaigns, where they go to people in the media and they say, hey guys, you shouldn't let these people on, you know, they're dodgy, you'll get into trouble. That's a whispering campaign. So that's what we're up against. They won't debate. You know, you cannot get them to come on. I think you tried to get someone to come onto this program.
That's absolutely
they won't
true.
debate.
We did try to get other people to come on, but they said they do not talk with conspiracy theorists. And we, in this program, we said that we wanted to talk about questions that have been risen in the public sphere. They did not want to debate. I'm sorry, go ahead, you can continue.
They are the conspiracy theorists. Conspiracy theory, if it means anything, is a simple story which, you know, claims to explain a major complicated event. That is exactly what the official story of the 9/11 attacks is. Very simple story, all organized by a guy in a cave with 17 hijackers who were just incredibly lucky. You could not get more of a conspiracy theory than that. And, you know, I think it is valid to use that phrase, but you have to then recognize that the official story is the conspiracy theory, and we're the sort of ordinary guys who are just trying to say that things aren't, we don't think it's that simple, and we think maybe these guys were encouraged or a way was cleared for them, and there's a lot of evidence it was, you know, the paper trail.
Okay, but if I go to Annie right now, I mean, then who did pull this off? Would you like to name a name, an organization, and the motivation for doing it? Because if it was a planned demolition, then there's a lot of politics behind that. That was a lot of work to pull that operation off. Who's behind it?
Well, this is what nobody on the planet appears to know at the moment. We have had a 9/11 Truth Commission in the US, but even the chairs of that commission, Keane and Hamilton, have said that they were set up to fail. So even they admit that they haven't got to the root cause of what happened on 9/11. So what this 9/11 Truth movement, which is a global movement of millions of concerned citizens, as well as many, many professional people with expertise in the relevant fields, are asking for, is a new independent and impartial and also potentially international inquiry to get to the root of this. And I think it's very relevant. I mean, it continues to affect all of us around the planet to this day, because we're looking at an event, the key event, that is still referred to continually by our politicians and our governments, that is used to justify the ongoing wars in the Middle East and the war on terror, and also to justify the erosion of all our individual freedoms in our countries. So it's a very important issue. It continues to be an issue of great relevance, But I don't think anyone can say, hand on heart, that we know who actually committed it.
You know, one of the things that I found very odd in looking at the 9/11 Commission report is that it's quite sloppy, and I'm not an expert in the field, but there's a lot of things I've read to say they seem to not be wanting to talk about that or move over things very quickly, about like building number 7 and things like that. But then you have this operation of amazing sophistication. How can we have both simultaneously? Because it's like Keystone Cops and James Bond. If I could go back to Ian, I mean, how do we square that?
Well, they didn't really need to provide a good story at the 9/11 Commission because, you know, they knew that the American media would just publish anything they say as being the truth, and they don't really care about the fringe. They don't care about the 30% of people who don't believe the official story, so long as they can trust the American mainstream media to go on pumping out, you know, what they're saying. I think one point I would just like to make is Richard's done fantastic work on the collapse of the towers, but there is a lot of other very, very worrying evidence that this could have been some sort of an inside job from the paper trail. And, you know, a lot of us have done a lot of work on that. It doesn't go over very well on the internet because the internet likes, you know, simple stories and simple pictures and things. But, you know, some of us have really dug away and we've read all the fine print of the official reports and so on. And it's amazing how many lies they did tell. And I'm not saying that as so-called a conspiracy theorist. I'm saying that as somebody who's just following the evidence that they have since produced. Could I just mention 3 huge lies that they told at the time of 9/11, which can now be debunked on the basis of evidence that's come forward from official sources? Would you mind just bearing with me?
Go right ahead.
Yeah. The first lie was the CIA didn't have any contacts in Afghanistan. Actually, the CIA had a super secret Osama bin Laden unit with 80 CIA officers working in it. That probably means maybe 500 people if you include the ancillary staff. There was almost a mini CIA working on Osama bin Laden, either running him as an agent or attemptedly monitoring him, although they didn't do a very good job of that. That's the first whopper of a lie. The next one is that they were taken by surprise. Totally not true. George Bush was warned of almost exactly what might happen in August of 2001. No action was taken. We'd like to know, you know, there's definitely, beyond any doubt, gross incompetence. Third lie, it was all an intelligence failure. Again, not true. The FBI was prevented by those guys in the CIA from investigating the hijackers. They had identified some of the alleged hijackers prior to 9/11. They went to the CIA. This is all on the record. You know, I'm not speculating. It's all on the official record now. The media haven't noticed because the media aren't interested. But they went to the CIA and they said, we'd like some information on these guys. They had the legal right to demand it as well. The CIA said, no, you know, we're not telling you anything. There was nearly a punch-up.
Okay.
You know, that's how bad it was.
Okay, I'd like to go back to Richard. I mean, again, you know, scientists versus scientists. We'll go back to politics in a second, but why is the establishment in the United States and the worldwide wanting to debunk you so quickly? Like I said, I'm not a scientist, so I can't judge with authenticity if you're just giving me a snow job. But it's certainly, the establishment could, but they won't engage you or they just completely dismiss you. They call you a fraud. I mean, what is it? Why can't these scientists sit down and say, no, you got that wrong, you got this right, etc., etc.? Why can't we see that happen?
Those who have something to hide cannot afford to come out and give us a forum to present our evidence, although the Washington Times did a very good job of that. So we're presenting our evidence directly to the American people, directly to Congress. We've given now our petition with 1,000 architect and engineer petition signers demanding a new investigation to every member of Congress. We're also calling for Eric Holder, Attorney General of the United States, to impanel a federal grand jury to investigate NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, specifically Sean Sunder, project leader, and his co-project leader, John Gross. These individuals are responsible for cover-up, speaking about fabrications and unscientific reports. The NIST reports for all 3 of these buildings, these 3 skyscrapers, is full of incredible misinformation and omissions and unscientific
Okay, Richard, if I could interrupt you
for
there,
instance,
we're going to go to a short break, but when we return, we'll continue our discussion on the controversy surrounding 9/11. Stay with our team.
When was this done?
Pardon?
When?
In the last couple of months or two.
This show? Okay.
Life in Russia would be so much brighter if you knew more about someone from first impressions.
They don't usually include these commercials.
Meetfriends.rt.com.
Welcome back to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing whether the people have been denied the truth about 9/11 or whether conspiracy theorists are just turning this tragedy into an industry. But before, let's see what Russians think about the issue.
9/11, two numbers that shook the world. On the 11th of September 2001, Al-Qaeda hijackers seized 4 passenger airliners and used them to commit massive acts of terror, killing thousands of innocent people in New York City, the state of Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. This is the official version. However, doubts and conspiracy theories explaining this tragedy and its aftermath are plentiful. The U.S. responded to the attacks by launching military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Russian Public Opinion Center asked what Russians see as the real reason behind the operations. 72% believe Washington's real goal is to strengthen its position by more aggressively exporting and enforcing its worldview. 18% think the U.S. aim is to strike against international terror networks, a point of view held mostly by young Russians, while the older generation remains more skeptical of U.S. intentions. Either way, the legacy of 9/11 will be argued over by those who accept the official version of modern history and those who do not. Back to you, Peter.
Okay, Annie, I'd like to go to you. Now, let's assume Richard's right. Okay, these buildings were intentionally brought down through demolition. What role does Al-Qaeda play in all of this? What role do the airplanes play in all of this? Because there are some people in the 9/11 movement that don't even believe in airplanes, but they're a minority. What are the connection between these two? Demolition, Al-Qaeda, planes.
Well, it goes back to a theory, a possibility that 9/11 might have been an attack called a false flag attack, which is where you have a terrorist atrocity occurring, which is blamed on one group of people for political reasons, political advantage, but is actually carried out by another. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily the case in 9/11, but it's something that we need to bear in mind. And in fact, this is the reason why I got involved in questioning the issues around 9/11, because as a former intelligence officer for the UK MI5, in the 1990s, I ended up helping to blow the whistle on crimes and corruption within the UK spy community. And in that case, the main reason why I and my ex-partner went public was because of a false flag attack that was perpetrated by the UK spy agencies. And in this case, we had MI6, which is a sort of external intelligence gathering agency, funding an assassination attempt against Colonel Gaddafi of Libya in 1996. And this went wrong, and this killed innocent people, and this was illegal under UK law. So I'm obviously personally aware that false flag is a historic reality. And once you accept that, you have to suddenly then think, well, okay, who benefits from an attack like 9/11? Is it perhaps a bunch of Islamic extremists in a cave in Tora Bora? Or might there be other parties that do benefit? And one of the big issues around 9/11 that does make people question is the issue of put options, where some financiers somewhere bet that the stock of US and American airlines would plummet around that date. And they bet huge amounts of money on this and made huge profits. And yet when it came to the 9/11 Truth Commission looking at this, they just said, well, you know, this doesn't go back to Al-Qaeda, so we don't need to follow the money trail. Now, I'm sorry, if you're looking at a major crime scene and you look at, well, someone made money on the back of that, then you have to wonder, well, are they the people who perhaps perpetrated the attack? So that's the linkage is, yes, the laws of physics indicate that the towers didn't come down the way that we've been told they did, and therefore there are questions around who might have set any explosives that were set and that sort of thing. So we have to accept that false flag is a perfectly standard weapon in the arsenal of governments and intelligence agencies, and is used around the planet for all sorts of nefarious means.
Okay, Ian, if we, so we have, in theory, one theory, is that Al-Qaeda is just a surrogate for the people that did this demolition? I mean, that's essentially what is being said here. That's...
Yeah, well, I mean, the question is, not does Al-Qaeda exist or not? The question is, who controls Al-Qaeda and who controls any particular Al-Qaeda cell? So, for instance, the Palestinians are claiming that they caught the Israelis red-handed creating a false Al-Qaeda cell. Now, that may or may not be true, but, it's a legitimate question to ask. It can happen at any time. Cells can get taken over, a whole organization can get taken over and run in the interests of somebody quite different. And we know that Al-Qaeda always was. It actually means the list. And it means, as Robin Cook, the British Foreign Secretary, very widely respected guy, he told us this in The Guardian shortly before he died of a heart attack. He said Al-Qaeda actually means the list held by the CIA of Arab terrorists when the CIA was backing the Arab terrorists in Afghanistan in the 1980s. So, it's not unreasonable to ask whether the CIA actually gave up on this
at the same time, we see the CIA botching so many different operations, over the years, over the last few decades. I mean, they got lucky with this one. I mean, I'm just trying to flesh this out.
No, sure,
here,
that's
okay?
No, that's right. I think you've got a good point there. But the answer to that is, you only hear about the operations when they fail. And the CIA guys themselves, if you listen to them carefully, they'll say, well, actually, we've had some fantastic operations which have succeeded. And to succeed fully, of course, nobody would know that they even existed as operations.
And it's very hard to trust a spook. Sorry, Annie, but it's that's how it is. All right. I'd like to ask all of you the same question.
You see, can I just make another point?
Go right ahead. Go ahead.
Just before you go on. Yeah. They flatter journalists. The basic message is, we're stupid, you're clever. Now, journalists love to hear that. They've got a lot of copy to write. They haven't got much time to do it in. They don't really have time to do any research nowadays. So, somebody coming along saying, you're really clever, we're really stupid, they just buy into that so easily. And it's, I don't think it's true. I've got a lot of respect for the CIA. I think they're very good at their job.
Okay, I'd like to ask you all the same question here, and it's being kind of cynical. All of you write and you make DVDs and you go speaking tours. I mean, some people would say, look, this is just a money-making industry. You guys are doing quite well. There's a huge interest out there. No. I'm just saying what the cynic would say. That's what the cynic would say. How do you all address that? I'd like to go to Richard first. I saw your DVD. I mean, it did cost money to make that, obviously, and you obviously want it sold. I mean, how do you address this issue of profiting, quote-unquote, off of the 9/11 tragedy? Richard first.
Yeah, I can assure you there's no profit. We're usually in the red from month to month. I rent a bedroom in somebody else's house for $400 a month, so nobody's getting rich here. What we have, and what's important for your audience to realize, is that we're talking about evidence. We're trying to get a message to the American people. For instance, why is there several tons of molten metal found at the base of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers, flowing like lava, the first responders say. The structural engineers find it. It's documented in videos and photos. Molten metal takes about 3,000 degrees to get it flowing, Fahrenheit. And the fires were only about half of that temperature. So, and jet fuel only burns about half of that temperature. So where do these temperatures come from to melt all of this metal? Well, it turns out to be molten iron. Molten iron is the byproduct of thermite, an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. And there's chemical evidence of thermite in the molten metal, in the ends of the beams.
Richard,
in
if I can
small
interrupt you with all
spheres found throughout the dust.
With all due respect, see, there you go again. Because the science part of it, I just kind of think, oh my God, I didn't do very well in high school chemistry. I'm trying to think if this makes any sense. And I'm not saying what you're saying isn't true. But my point is the delivery, because I think that's where a lot of people start questioning the questioners, because this is kind of complicated stuff, okay? And that's why, you know, the political end of it.
It's not that complicated.
No, and I'm sure you would be a great teacher. I'm sure you'd be a great teacher, but I'm just trying to put myself in the average person's situation here. But I want to go back to my question about making. I want to go back to. No. I'd like to ask
them this.
No, but Richard, I need to ask everyone the same question, and we'll go back to you. Ian, how about that charge? You know, this is the 9/11 industry. People are making money off of it. How do you answer that charge? Because it seems to me that, you know, you have but you have these websites that go out, and now there's a new generation of counter, and then the counter them, and it just goes around and around the books and the DVDs, the films, the documentaries. You know, there is this kind of cyclical thing. Go right ahead.
I don't know anybody who's making any money out of this. I've got a coffee business. Perhaps I'd better not plug it here because I'll be accused of trying to make money. But, you know, I could be earning a lot more money in my coffee business than I do in this. And I had a best-selling book on 9/11. You wouldn't know it from the media here, but actually my book was a non-fiction bestseller. And even that didn't make any money. I think it's actually, you know, if you don't mind me turning this around, I can tell you one guy who did make an awful lot of money out of 9/11, and that's Kofor Black, the head of the CIA Counterintelligence Operations Department. He was the guy whose intelligence failings, so-called, allowed 9/11 to happen. And he's made an absolute shed load of money. He's a principal in the mercenary company Blackwater, which, you know, has been the subject of huge scandal in Iraq with their no-bid contracts. So, you know, once again, they call us conspiracy theorists. They're the conspiracy theorists. They call us trying to make money out of it. Actually, a lot of money was made out of 9/11, and it was made by individuals in the CIA who should have been sacked. It was made by the Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, who instituted torture as a weapon of war. It was made by the American media, who had huge viewing figures. You know, yeah, a lot of money is getting made, but it's certainly not by me, I promise you that. My books are open.
Okay, and it looks like, as usual, government officials, when they fail, they get rewarded for it. How do you address that issue? I mean, you know, you do write about this, you do talk about it. I mean, do you get that you know, you're just doing this for money, it's to become popular, fame, things like that? I mean, you know, this industry just churns itself around because there's so many different opinions about it. People really enjoy it, too. I tend to think that people find it entertaining, actually.
Well, I hope not, because, I mean, we're talking about a tragedy, not just for the people who lost their lives on 9/11, but also the millions in the Middle East who suffered as a consequence of the fallout from 9/11. But I don't think anyone would go into this campaigning for a new inquiry and asking for the truth of the events because they enjoy the profile they get, because you just end up being vilified by the mainstream
All right,
media
I'm afraid
conspiracy narrative.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I want to thank our guests today, Annie Michonne, Richard Gage, and Ian Henschel. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.
Thank you for your attention. I'm going to turn the lights on. We're going to look at 3 questions closely related. And I wanted you to see those 3 participants who are defending the right and the necessity of questioning the official narrative. You'll hear it often said that everybody knows that. Well, a lot of times, the people who say everybody knows that don't know it themselves, and they're trying to bully you and me into agreeing with them, which is the reason people need to understand logic. They need to understand how Americans got as uninformed and as naive as they did. And that goes back at least to actually it goes back to 1908 specifically, and before then. But I wanted you to see this so that you know, have some idea as to where we're going. Who's in charge? Where are they taking us? And how did we let the situation develop that they're taking us like sheep, lambs to the slaughter? And we're going to look at the beginning, one of the two beginnings, one of two or three beginnings with Norman Dodd next week, because Norman Dodd tells us a great deal about how you and I were educated. We'll see you next week.